So today we're going to read Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman? So let's start with our background information, and we can then move on from there. So, after her escape from slavery, Sojourner Truth became a vocal supporter of the abolitionist movement and the feminist movement. In 1851, Sojourner Truth attended the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, where a group of men monopolized the audience with biblical evidence for keeping women subservient. Truth, who had not planned to speak, felt compelled to respond. She stood and gave the following speech. Read the passage carefully. We are not writing an essay. We are just going to analyze the rhetorical choices that Sojourner Truth makes to convey her message that women should have more rights. Also, they didn't just use biblical evidence, they used other logic, trying to apply logic to why women should be subservient. And Sojourner Truth is able to apply logic to fight their logic. So we're going to start with our S in Soapstone. And our S is speaker. Okay, our S is speaker. We know that she was escaped from slavery. We know that she was a member of the abolitionist movement and the feminist movement. Of course, the abolitionist was aimed at ending slavery. And so that's kind of what we're given here as far as our speaker. Does that mean there's all there is that we're going to learn about our speaker? Absolutely not. The next thing in our soapstone method, of course, is the O, the occasion. Now I'm going to leave a little room, so in case I want to make some notes there, I can. The occasion that the speaker is speaking. This includes exigence, what caused her to stand up and speak, as well as the context. What is the exigence and context? I'm just going to go ahead and write my notes out to the side here. Well, we know it's 1851. That's going to have bearing on how she speaks, the ideas and sensibilities of the time. Also, when we say feminist, keep in mind we're talking about a very different time. So when you think of feminist, don't apply your modern sense of what that is to the arguments being had in 1851. We're at a women's rights convention. We have the group of men who monopolized the audience. Women's Rights Convention. Forced her to speak. The men's dominating the speeches caused her to speak. We've already got some information that we can write about, that we can answer questions. We're already assembling that information. Now, the next thing, of course, in our soapstone method is our audience. So, our audience is whom? Well, the women at the conference. Women at the conference. Spelling, not my strong point. The women at the conference are the audience, but that may not be the only audience that you determine. Much like the Reagan speech that we already did, there's multiple audiences sometimes. So we're going to leave a little space there. Now, what's her purpose? Well, her purpose, at least from what we've been gathering here, women should have rights. And her purpose is to refute the men. So her purpose is women's rights. I do want to take this moment to point out women, plural, woman, man. So be sure, because I have lots of students that will say a women when they're talking about one, because they're not being careful watching their spellings and their plurality. All right. So the purposes of the is about women's rights, and to issue a rebuttal to the men's arguments. Now, we may come back to more of that. Going to be the other S, which is the subject, and that is women's rights. Now, again, we can add to this. And that's why I'm color coding, so that I can mark things as I go. So let's read the speech. Well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? A member of the audience whispers, intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where'd your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. One of the things that we see right off the bat, and I want you to realize Sojourner Truth was already a very prominent individual. People knew her. Her story was very out there. So when she stood up to speak, people really listened, and reporters and that started writing this down so that they could have a record of what she said. So what's she doing in this first paragraph? Well, this first paragraph seems to be stating the current situation. 1850s, we had the abolitionist movement. We had the beginning of the real fight for the freeing of slaves, of African American slaves, and the ending of slavery. We had women starting to fight and say, you know what, my money shouldn't be my husband's or my dad's. My body, I should be able to, control, at least in the most basic things of safety and well-being. You have all this going on, and of course then in the 1860s is when we get the Civil War, which really pushed women's rights back and out of the focus until much later in the late 1890s, and then gaining steam in the 1900s, the early 1900s. So there's a lot going on here. But what do we also realize about her, because she's a former slave? Well, she hasn't had a great traditional education, but don't let her language, her way of presenting herself fool you. She's very intelligent. She may not have a traditional education, but she's very intelligent and very thoughtful. So don't ever rule out just because somebody doesn't necessarily present the way that you would expect them to present in a formal environment like this. Not everybody's had the same opportunities. So this is very different than the Reagan speech that we covered, where it was very polished and everything was very choreographed. Plus, Sojourner Truth, she brought this up on her own, off the cuff, without any prep. So this is extemporaneous speech, unplanned speech. Let's talk about her argument now. That man over there, this is another bit of the audience. We said it was women, but she actually points to one of the men that was arguing against women's rights and calling him out. Now, she's not saying you, she's saying that man over there, because if she says you, then she's opening up a dialogue individually between him and her, and he can feel he can respond, and that's not what she wants. So while she is speaking to him, he is part of the audience that she's aiming at. She's speaking about him, so he doesn't feel that he can respond because he's not the only audience. So, but he is part of the audience, and she does it later as well. The part of the audience is the men who spoke against women's rights. And that's an effective way to sometimes prevent that person from speaking up if you want them to just listen. All right, so then she goes into his argument. She restates his argument. And if you're going to rebut somebody's argument, it's good to listen to what they have to say and then restate what they've said. What I hear you saying is, and that's what she does here. The problem with his argument is that it's full of stereotypes. Now, I'm guessing that he probably is an upper class white man, upper middle class, and so he's viewing women from his experience of women, upper class women, not women who are engaged in manual labor, lower class, women of color, and poor white women. He's really stereotyping as if all women get helped into carriages, lifted over mud ditches, and get treated with this ultimate respect and courtesy. And then she goes to herself to point out that nobody ever helps her into carriages. This is part of her subject. And she's using herself as an example of how this doesn't fly. She then goes on that the life she's led has led her to be a very strong person, physically strong. She's plowed, she's planted, she's gathered into barns. Remember 1850, we're talking about well before industrialized farming, where machinery was non-existent or considered much more expensive than what manual slave labor was considered. So she's pointing this out, that she could keep up with the men because she was doing the work. She did manual labor and was as capable as her male counterparts. She's pointing this out. She also uses a rhetorical device here that I think is important to point out, because she uses it 4 times in this paragraph. Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman? So she uses this 4 times, this rhetorical question. So what we actually have is 2 literary devices together. Rhetorical question, which we've talked about all year, and repetition. to make people think. Repetition to make people think. She also employs emotional language. She employs to people's sense of pathos here. Sense of emotion, of what she's had to be through. She had to be strong when losing her children. She had to be strong when losing her children. We also have this very dark detail here. She could bear the lash as well. She could be whipped and take whippings from her slave owners just as well as the men. It's a dark detail, but it's meant to shake people up in the room. Then she goes on. Then they talk about this thing in the head. And here's where I think that her speech is, well, I mean, it's masterful all the way through, especially for an unplanned speech. But she acknowledges her own limitations. She's not afraid to ask, what was that word? She's not trying to cover like she knows all. She's saying, what was that word? Oh, yeah, intellect. That's it, honey. That term of endearment, making it very personal, connecting with her audience. Connecting personally with the audience. The audience. Then she goes on to say, what does it matter if some people are more intelligent than others or more capable than others intellectually? What does it matter?